A cold breeze swept through the bustling streets of downtown as people hurried past the windows of a quaint little cafe. The cafe was warm, filled with the hum of conversation and the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee and baked goods. Inside, polished tables glistened under the soft glow of hanging lights, and patrons leaned into their conversations, oblivious to the small drama about to unfold. Among the well-dressed crowd of professionals, students, and families, no one noticed when an elderly man pushed open the glass door. Mr. Gerald was an unassuming figure, his presence almost ghostly. His weathered face bore the lines of decades of hard work, and his frayed coat hung loosely on his thin frame. His shoes were scuffed, their soles barely holding together, a testament to countless miles walked. He paused just inside the door, his eyes darting around the room. The chatter and laughter softened as a few heads turned to glance at the man who so clearly didn't belong to this polished scene. He hesitated, clutching a worn leather wallet that looked as though it had seen better days. Summoning his courage, Mr. Gerald shuffled toward the counter, his movements deliberate but fragile. Behind the counter stood the cafe manager, a middle-aged man with a neatly trimmed beard and a sharp suit that seemed too formal for his position. The manager's expression was cold and calculating as Mr. Gerald approached, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Excuse me, sir," Mr. Gerald began, his voice soft but steady. "Could I have something small to eat? Maybe a sandwich and a cup of coffee? I can pay." He trailed off, opening his wallet to reveal a few crumpled bills and some loose coins. The amount was clearly meager, but he held it out earnestly. The manager raised an eyebrow, his lip curling into a smirk. "Sir, this is not a charity," he said, his tone loud enough to draw the attention of nearby customers. "If you can't afford our menu prices, I suggest you try somewhere else." Mr. Gerald flushed, his cheeks burning with embarrassment. I can pay," he stammered. "Just something small. I haven't eaten today." The manager's voice grew sharper, cutting through the air like a knife. "I'm sorry, but we have paying customers here. We can't have people like you loitering around." He gestured toward the door, his message clear. A hush fell over the cafe as other patrons began to take notice. A young couple near the window exchanged uneasy glances, while an elderly woman sitting by the fireplace frowned in disapproval, but no one intervened. Mr. Gerald stood there, his trembling hands still holding out the money, his dignity crumbling under the weight of the humiliation. His eyes flickered around the room, looking for a kind face, but none met his gaze. "Please," he said again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just need." "Enough," the manager snapped, his voice rising. "I told you to leave." He stepped out from behind the counter, towering over Mr. Gerald. "Now." The cafe door swung open, and a gust of cold air rushed in, making Mr. Gerald flinch. A tall woman with striking features entered, her long coat trailing behind her as she stepped into the room. Her presence was commanding, her sharp eyes scanning the scene. She paused as she took in the sight of the elderly man, the manager, and the silent crowd. "What's going on here?" she asked, her voice calm but firm, slicing through the tension like a blade. The manager stiffened, his bravado faltering slightly. "Nothing, ma'am," he said quickly, adopting a more polite tone. This gentleman was causing a disturbance. The woman tilted her head, her piercing gaze landing on Mr. Gerald. "Causing a disturbance, or just asking for a meal?" The manager's face flushed. "Look, this isn't the place for—" She raised a hand, cutting him off. "I think I've heard enough." She turned to Mr. Gerald and smiled gently. "Have you eaten yet today?" "No, ma'am," he replied, his voice shaky, but grateful for her acknowledgement. She nodded, reaching into her bag and pulling out a crisp bill. "I'd like to pay for his meal," she said, turning to the manager with an expression that brooked no argument. "Give him whatever he wants." The manager hesitated, his jaw tightening, but the murmurs among the patrons were growing louder. People began whispering, their disapproval evident. With a forced smile, he nodded. "Of course. Right away." Mr. Gerald's eyes welled with tears as he looked at the woman. "Thank you," he said, his voice breaking. "Thank you so much." She waved it off with a warm smile. "No need to thank me. Just eat and take care of yourself." She glanced around the cafe, her gaze lingering on the silent patrons who had watched the scene unfold. Sometimes it takes just a little kindness to make a big difference. As Mr. Gerald was seated and served a steaming plate of food, the atmosphere in the cafe shifted. Some patrons looked ashamed, while others seemed inspired. The woman, without fanfare, took a seat in the corner and quietly sipped her coffee, her attention seemingly elsewhere. But what no one realized at that moment was that this simple act of kindness was only the beginning of something much bigger. The crisp autumn evening had settled over the town as Mr. Gerald sat at the cafe table, savoring every bite of the warm sandwich in front of him. The room had returned to its usual hum of chatter, but the air still carried an undercurrent of tension. Some patrons occasionally glanced in his direction, their faces reflecting a mixture of guilt and discomfort. The woman who had paid for his meal had since returned to her own seat, her sharp features softened as she sipped her coffee and appeared lost in thought. Mr. Gerald's mind drifted back to how his day had begun. It was meant to be just another day, like so many others. The sun had risen on the small one-room space he rented above an old garage on the edge of town. The room was simple: a bed, a small table, and a cracked window that let in the chill of the morning air. Life hadn't always been this way. There was a time when he had owned a modest home, built with his own hands when he was a carpenter. A lifetime of honest work had been undone in just a few cruel years, the weight of mounting medical bills, and the loss of his wife crushing him under a financial burden he couldn't escape. He had once been a man of pride and dignity, known in the community for his craftsmanship and quiet generosity. But time had a way of erasing even the strongest foundations, and now, at 74, Gerald found himself navigating a world that seemed to have forgotten him. He had woken that morning with a growling stomach, counting the last few coins in his wallet, and deciding to splurge on a meal, a rare luxury. The cafe had seemed like a safe choice, a place where he could quietly enjoy a sandwich and maybe even indulge in a cup of coffee. He hadn't expected to be humiliated in front of a room full of strangers. The woman who had helped him remained a mystery. He watched her from the corner of his eye, her poised demeanor and quiet confidence standing in stark contrast to the other patrons. She was unlike anyone he'd encountered in a long time. Direct, unyielding, yet deeply compassionate. Gerald wondered what had compelled her to step in when no one else did. Most people he'd encountered over the years had perfected the art of looking through him, treating him as though he were invisible. The woman, whose name was Rebecca, had been coming to this cafe for years, but this evening had been unlike any other. She was a successful business owner, running a small but thriving chain of restaurants known for their welcoming atmosphere and commitment to supporting local communities. Her path to success had been far from easy. She had grown up in poverty, raised by a single mother who worked multiple jobs to keep food on the table. Rebecca's success was hard-won, and she carried the lessons of her upbringing with her everywhere she went. Rebecca had been in the cafe that evening for a brief respite from her hectic schedule. She often visited to clear her mind, sipping coffee as she planned her next move or reflected on the challenges she faced. But tonight, the sight of Gerald's quiet desperation and the manager's cruel response struck a nerve she couldn't ignore. She had seen that same look of shame on her mother's face too many times when she was a child. Moments when the world had turned its back on them simply because they were struggling. After finishing her coffee, Rebecca stood, smoothing her coat as she prepared to leave. But before stepping out into the cold night, she approached Gerald's table. "Sir," she said softly, drawing his attention. Gerald looked up, startled but grateful. "Yes, Mom," he replied, his voice steady now, though his eyes still held the weight of everything that had happened. "I just wanted to say that you handled yourself with dignity back there," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "What happened to you was wrong, and I'm sorry you had to go through it." Gerald blinked, his throat tightening. "Thank you, ma'am. Your kindness means more than I can say." Rebecca hesitated for a moment, then placed a business card on the table. "I own a few restaurants around town. If you ever need a meal or anything else, you come to one of them, and you won't pay a dime. No questions asked." Gerald stared at the card, overwhelmed by her generosity. He opened his mouth to respond, but Rebecca held up a hand. "It's not charity," she said firmly. "It's just one person trying to help another. And if you can pay it forward someday, that's all I'd ask." With that, she turned and walked out, leaving Gerald holding the card like it was a lifeline. He read the name on it over and over, Rebecca Allen. The name sounded familiar, but he couldn't place it. All he knew was that her act of kindness had given him something he hadn't felt in years: hope. That night, as Gerald made his way back to his small room, the cold wind biting at his face, he couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. He had spent so long feeling invisible, like the world had moved on without him. But in one evening, a stranger had reminded him that there were still people who cared, who were willing to stand up for what was right. It was a small gesture, but it carried the weight of a lifetime. Meanwhile, Rebecca drove home in silence, her mind racing. She couldn't shake the image of Gerald standing at that counter, his trembling hands clutching his wallet. She thought about how many others like him existed in the shadows, people whose stories were never told, whose struggles went unnoticed. She had always believed in using her success to make a difference, but tonight had reminded her of just how urgent that mission was. As she pulled into her driveway, Rebecca made a decision. The next morning, she would take steps to ensure that her restaurants became a haven for anyone in need, just as her mother had dreamed of doing all those years ago. But this wasn't just about meals. It was about restoring dignity to those who had been cast aside. For Gerald, the card in his pocket was more than a promise of food. It was a reminder that one act of kindness could ripple outward, touching lives in ways he couldn't yet imagine. For Rebecca, that evening marked the beginning of something much bigger than herself, a commitment to transforming not just her business, but the community around her. Neither of them knew it yet, but their paths had crossed at exactly the right moment, setting in motion a chain of events that would change both their lives and the town forever. The video captured by the young couple at the cafe began circulating online the same night. At first, it was just a few shares among friends who were outraged by the way the elderly man had been treated. But as the hours passed, the video gained momentum, spreading far beyond the small town. By morning, it had reached thousands of views, with comments pouring in from people expressing their anger at the cafe manager and their sympathy for the old man. Social media had turned a quiet injustice into a public scandal. In the town, the cafe was at the center of attention. Regular patrons arrived that morning to find the usual cozy atmosphere replaced with an air of unease. The manager, who had prided himself on running one of the most popular establishments in the area, now faced the backlash of his actions. His name was in the comments of the video, and his behavior was being dissected by strangers across the internet. At the same time, Rebecca was busy putting her plan into action. She had woken early, her mind filled with thoughts of Mr. Gerald and the countless others like him who went unnoticed. She spent the morning making calls to her restaurant managers, instructing them to set up a system for providing free meals to those in need. It wasn't a publicity stunt. It was a deeply personal mission. She didn't care if anyone knew what she was doing. What mattered was that people like Gerald wouldn't have to face such humiliation again. But as Rebecca made her plans, the town itself was grappling with the aftermath of the video. Conversations about the incident began to surface everywhere. At the local grocery store, in the school parking lot, and even in church pews. Some people were outraged, demanding accountability from the cafe. Others tried to dismiss it, claiming the elderly man should have found a more appropriate place to ask for help. Still, the overwhelming majority seemed to agree that something about the situation felt profoundly wrong. As the cafe's reputation crumbled, Gerald was oblivious to the chaos unfolding around him. He had spent the night in quiet reflection, still holding on to Rebecca's card like a lifeline. The simple gesture had given him more than just a promise of a meal. It had restored a sense of worth he thought he'd lost forever. That morning, he decided to visit one of Rebecca's restaurants, not to ask for food, but to express his gratitude. When Gerald arrived at the small diner Rebecca owned on the outskirts of town, he was greeted warmly by a young server who seemed to know exactly who he was. "Mr. Gerald, right?" she said with a smile. "Rebecca told us you might stop by. Please, sit anywhere you like." Gerald hesitated. He wasn't used to such kindness, and it caught him off guard. "I don't want to be any trouble," he murmured. "No trouble at all," the server replied, guiding him to a corner booth. "You're our guest today." As Gerald settled into the booth, the server brought him a steaming cup of coffee and a menu, though she assured him he could order anything he wanted. Gerald's hands trembled slightly as he lifted the cup to his lips, the warmth spreading through him. For the first time in years, he felt truly welcome somewhere. Meanwhile, the young couple who had filmed the incident decided to visit the cafe again, not for a meal but to confront the manager. They weren't activists or journalists. They were simply residents who had been deeply moved by what they'd witnessed. When they walked through the door, the manager's expression hardened. He recognized them instantly, and his defensiveness was palpable. "We just wanted to ask why you treated that man the way you did," the young woman said, her tone calm but firm. "He wasn't asking for a handout. He was willing to pay." The manager's response was curt. "This is a business, not a soup kitchen. I did what I thought was right at the time." "Right?" the young man interjected, his voice rising slightly. "You humiliated him in front of everyone. How is that right?" The exchange grew heated, drawing the attention of other customers. Some nodded in agreement with the couple, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The manager, realizing he was losing control of the situation, retreated to the back office, leaving the cafe in an awkward silence. Word of this confrontation spread quickly, adding fuel to the growing outrage. By afternoon, local news outlets had picked up the story, broadcasting the video alongside interviews with witnesses. People from all over the region began calling for a boycott of the cafe, and some even showed up with signs, protesting outside its doors. Rebecca, though aware of the escalating situation, chose not to involve herself directly. Instead, she focused on expanding her initiative, reaching out to other restaurant owners in town and encouraging them to join her effort. To her surprise, many of them agreed, inspired by her determination and the attention the story had brought to the issue of poverty in their community. As these changes began to take shape, Mr. Gerald's life also started to shift. After finishing his meal at Rebecca's diner, he struck up a conversation with the server, who turned out to be the owner's niece. She listened intently as he shared his story, his voice growing steadier as he spoke. By the end of their conversation, she had an idea. "My uncle owns a woodworking shop," she said. "He's always looking for experienced hands. If you're interested, I could introduce you." Gerald's eyes lit up. It had been years since he'd worked with wood, but the thought of doing so again filled him with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in ages. "I'd be honored," he said softly. That evening, Rebecca received a call from her niece, who eagerly shared the news. Rebecca smiled, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. Gerald's story was far from over, but already it was beginning to take a new shape. What had started as a moment of cruelty in a cafe was now blossoming into something transformative, not just for Gerald, but for the entire community. By the end of the day, the cafe that had once humiliated Gerald had closed early, unable to handle the wave of negative attention. Across town, Rebecca's restaurants were bustling, not just with regular customers, but also with those inspired to contribute to her cause. Donations poured in, volunteers signed up, and the atmosphere in her establishments was filled with hope and determination. For Gerald, it was the first time in years that he felt like part of something bigger than himself. And for Rebecca, it was proof that even the smallest acts of kindness could spark change far greater than anyone could imagine. As the town grappled with its own conscience, it became clear that this wasn't just about a single meal. It was about the power of humanity to choose compassion over indifference. The next morning, the cafe where Gerald had been humiliated was eerily quiet. Normally bustling with early morning patrons grabbing coffee and pastries on their way to work, it now stood almost empty. The boycott that had begun on social media was proving effective, and the few customers who did enter seemed more interested in scolding the staff than ordering anything. Outside, a small group of protesters had gathered, holding signs that read, "Kindness costs nothing, and humanity over profit." The cafe manager peered out the window, his face pale and drawn. The once flourishing business was unraveling before his eyes. Meanwhile, Rebecca was busy putting the final touches on a bold plan she had devised overnight. She had spent hours brainstorming ways to channel the outrage sparked by the incident into something positive. By dawn, her vision was clear. A community gathering focused on compassion, with free meals provided by her restaurants and a spotlight on local organizations that supported the homeless and underprivileged. She hoped it would not only help Gerald but also inspire others to take action in their own ways. Word spread quickly about the event, and by mid-morning, volunteers had started gathering at one of Rebecca's larger venues, a spacious restaurant with a courtyard that could accommodate a crowd. Among the volunteers was Gerald, who had arrived early after hearing about the event from Rebecca's niece. Though initially hesitant to attend, he felt a growing sense of responsibility to be part of something bigger than himself. For years, he had felt invisible, but now, for the first time in a long time, he was being seen. Rebecca greeted him warmly when he arrived. "Gerald," she said, extending her hand. "I'm so glad you came." He took her hand, his grip firm despite the tremble in his fingers. "I wasn't sure if I'd be much help," he admitted, "but I wanted to try." "You're more help than you realize," Rebecca replied. "Your story is what brought us all here today." As the preparations continued, the courtyard began to fill with people. Families, students, business owners, and even local politicians showed up, drawn by curiosity or a genuine desire to contribute. There was an air of excitement mixed with purpose, a feeling that something meaningful was taking place. Tables were set up with trays of food. Volunteers bustled back and forth, and a small stage was erected for speakers to address the crowd. When the event officially began, Rebecca took the stage, her voice steady and clear as she addressed the audience. "Thank you all for being here," she began. "What happened a few days ago at a cafe in our town was deeply upsetting. But instead of letting that moment divide us, we're here today to turn it into something constructive. This isn't about pointing fingers or assigning blame. It's about showing that we, as a community, can choose kindness, compassion, and action." The crowd erupted into applause, their energy palpable. Rebecca continued, introducing Gerald as the catalyst for the event. Gerald, hesitant but encouraged by Rebecca, stepped onto the stage. The murmurs of the crowd quieted as he took the microphone. "I'm not much for speeches," he began, his voice cracking slightly. "But I want to thank each and every one of you for being here. A few days ago, I felt like the world had forgotten me, like I didn't matter. But today, seeing all of you, I know that's not true." The crowd applauded again, and Gerald's eyes glistened with tears. "Rebecca didn't just give me a meal," he continued. "She gave me hope. And hope is something we all need, especially in hard times. If my story can remind even one person to choose kindness, then it was worth it." As Gerald stepped off the stage, the applause was thunderous. People lined up to shake his hand, offer him words of encouragement, or simply thank him for his courage. For Gerald, the overwhelming support was almost surreal. He had spent years feeling invisible, and now he was at the center of something transformative. But the event wasn't just about Gerald. Throughout the day, local organizations set up booths to provide resources for the homeless and underprivileged. A donation drive collected clothing, blankets, and non-perishable food items. Rebecca's restaurant served free meals to anyone who needed one, no questions asked. The sense of community was stronger than ever, with people from all walks of life coming together to make a difference. Meanwhile, the cafe manager watched the event unfold from a distance. He hadn't been invited, but curiosity, and perhaps a touch of guilt, had drawn him there. Standing at the edge of the crowd, he observed the laughter, the camaraderie, and the undeniable impact of Rebecca's efforts. For the first time, he began to question his actions. Had he been so focused on running a profitable business that he had forgotten the humanity behind it? The thought gnawed at him as he quietly slipped away, unnoticed by the crowd. By the end of the day, the event had raised significant funds for local charities and inspired countless acts of kindness throughout the town. Gerald, though still adjusting to the sudden attention, felt a renewed sense of purpose. Rebecca's niece followed through on her promise, introducing him to her uncle, who offered Gerald a part-time job at his woodworking shop. Though Gerald hadn't worked with tools in years, the thought of crafting something with his hands again filled him with excitement. For Rebecca, the success of the event was just the beginning. She began working with other restaurant owners to establish a town-wide initiative called Plates of Kindness, where participating businesses would provide free meals to those in need on a regular basis. The initiative gained traction quickly, and soon other towns began reaching out to replicate the model. As the sun set on the event, Rebecca and Gerald stood together, watching the last of the crowd disperse. "You know," Gerald said, his voice thoughtful, "a few days ago, I thought I'd never have another good day. But today was more than I could have ever hoped for." Rebecca smiled, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You deserve it, Gerald. And this is only the beginning." Though the cafe incident had been a moment of cruelty, it had sparked a wave of compassion that transformed not only Gerald's life, but also the entire community. The story was no longer just about an elderly man being denied a meal. It was about the power of standing up for what's right and the ripple effect of a single act of kindness. As the weeks passed, the impact of the community event reverberated through the town, leaving a lasting mark on both its residents and its culture. The cafe where Gerald had been humiliated struggled to recover from the backlash. Its regular patrons had found other places to frequent, and the protest signs outside its doors had become a near-permanent fixture. News of the incident and the subsequent community response had traveled far and wide, drawing even national attention. For some, it was a cautionary tale about how one act of cruelty could spark widespread outrage. For others, it was a symbol of how a community could come together to demand better. Gerald's life, once marked by struggle and invisibility, had taken a dramatic turn. With the part-time job at the woodworking shop, he rediscovered not only his craft, but also a sense of purpose. The shop's owner, a jovial man named Thomas, quickly became both a mentor and a friend. Though Gerald's hands were slower than they had been in his youth, they still remembered the movements, the steady grip of a chisel, the gentle curve of sandpaper against wood. Each piece he worked on felt like a step toward reclaiming the dignity he thought he had lost forever. Word of Gerald's work spread, and soon, customers began requesting pieces made specifically by him. A retired schoolteacher ordered a custom bookshelf, while a local church commissioned a handcrafted altar. Gerald poured his heart into every project, his confidence growing with each completed piece. The shop became a second home to him, a place where he felt valued and appreciated. Rebecca, meanwhile, continued to expand her Plates of Kindness initiative. She worked tirelessly to ensure it wasn't just a short-lived response to the cafe incident, but a sustainable program that would endure. She partnered with local grocers and suppliers, negotiated with fellow restaurant owners, and even secured grants from charitable organizations. Her restaurants became hubs of generosity, offering free meals every Sunday to anyone in need. The initiative inspired neighboring towns to start their own versions, creating a network of support that reached far beyond Rebecca's original vision. The cafe manager, on the other hand, found himself facing the consequences of his actions. With the business floundering, he was forced to step down and sell the cafe to a new owner. The new management transformed the space into a community-focused eatery, where a portion of the profits went toward funding local shelters and food banks. Ironically, the cafe that had once been a symbol of cruelty became a beacon of hope, though the manager himself had long since left the town, his reputation in shambles. But not everyone was satisfied with the way things had turned out. A small but vocal group argued that the attention given to Gerald's story had overshadowed the struggles of others in the community. Rebecca took their criticism to heart, realizing they had a point. Poverty and hardship weren't unique to Gerald. They were realities for many. She expanded the initiative further, launching workshops and job training programs to address the root causes of poverty. Gerald, eager to give back, volunteered to teach woodworking classes as part of the program, passing on his skills to younger generations who lacked opportunities. One of Gerald's first students was a teenager named Liam, whose family had been struggling to make ends meet. Angry and disillusioned with the world, Liam had initially been skeptical about the class. But under Gerald's patient guidance, he discovered a talent for carving and a newfound sense of focus. Over time, Liam began to see Gerald not just as a teacher, but as a role model. The two formed a bond that transcended the classroom, with Gerald sharing stories of his life, his hardships, and the lessons he had learned about resilience and hope. The ripple effects of these changes extended far beyond the individuals involved. The town itself began to transform. Local businesses started implementing pay-it-forward programs, where customers could buy meals or goods for those in need. Schools organized food drives and clothing donations, while churches and community centers opened their doors to provide shelter during the harsh winter months. The sense of division that had once plagued the town was replaced by a spirit of cooperation and mutual support. For Gerald, the transformation wasn't just external, it was deeply personal. One evening, after a long day at the woodworking shop, he sat in his small but now warmly furnished room, reflecting on how much his life had changed. The card Rebecca had given him that night at the cafe still sat on his bedside table, a constant reminder of the kindness that had set everything in motion. He thought about the young man he used to be, full of dreams and ambitions, and the older man he had become, burdened by loss and hardship. For the first time in years, he felt like he had reclaimed a part of himself that he thought was gone forever. Rebecca, too, found herself reflecting on the journey that had begun with a single act of standing up for Gerald. She hadn't anticipated the scale of the impact or how it would change her own life. The initiative had grown beyond her wildest dreams, and though it required endless work and sacrifice, she felt deeply fulfilled. One evening, as she stood in one of her restaurants, watching volunteers serve meals to a line of grateful faces, she felt a profound sense of gratitude for the chain of events that had brought them all here. But the greatest transformation of all was in the community itself. What had once been a town like any other, with its share of indifference and apathy, had become a model for what compassion and action could achieve. People looked out for one another, and the story of Gerald's humiliation and the kindness that followed became a legend passed down to new generations. On the one-year anniversary of the event, the town held a celebration, not to dwell on the cruelty of the past, but to honor the progress they had made together. Gerald was the guest of honor, standing alongside Rebecca as they unveiled a plaque dedicated to the spirit of kindness and community. The plaque read, "In a world where you can be anything, be kind." As the crowd cheered and celebrated, Gerald looked out at the faces before him, young and old, rich and poor, all united by a shared commitment to compassion. He realized that what had started as a moment of humiliation had become the catalyst for a movement that changed countless lives, including his own. Later that night, as Gerald walked home under a sky full of stars, he felt a deep sense of peace. Life hadn't been easy, but it had led him to this moment, a moment where kindness had triumphed over cruelty and where hope had replaced despair. For the first time in years, Gerald allowed himself to dream again, knowing that he was no longer alone and that together they had built something truly extraordinary. As the years passed, the story of what had happened at the cafe and the remarkable transformation it sparked became a cornerstone of the town's identity. It was no longer just an incident frozen in time. It had evolved into a living legacy, woven into the very fabric of the community. What had begun as a moment of humiliation for Gerald had ignited a movement that reshaped not only his life, but the lives of countless others, touching hearts far beyond the town's borders. For Gerald, life had settled into a rhythm that he could never have imagined during those bleak years of isolation and despair. The woodworking shop, once just a job, had become a source of deep personal fulfillment. Gerald was no longer just an employee. He was a mentor, a storyteller, and a craftsman whose pieces now adorned homes, churches, and public spaces throughout the region. His handcrafted benches and intricate carvings had become symbols of resilience and hope, cherished not just for their beauty, but for the story they carried. The woodworking classes he taught at the community center had grown into a vibrant program that drew students of all ages. Some came to learn a new skill. Others came to rebuild their lives, just as Gerald had done. One of his students, Liam, who had once been an angry and disillusioned teenager, had flourished under Gerald's guidance. Now a young man with a steady job and a dream of starting his own furniture business, Liam often credited Gerald with changing the course of his life. On weekends, he volunteered alongside Gerald, helping to teach younger students and sharing his own story of transformation. Rebecca's Plates of Kindness initiative had also grown far beyond its humble beginnings. The network of participating restaurants had expanded across the state, creating a safety net for those in need. Inspired by the initiative's success, other towns and cities adopted similar programs, often seeking Rebecca's advice on how to implement them. She had become something of a local hero, though she remained humble, always emphasizing that the movement was a collective effort. Rebecca's work extended beyond food security. She began partnering with organizations to address the root causes of poverty, launching programs that provided job training, financial literacy workshops, and mental health support. Her restaurants became more than just places to eat. They were hubs of community activity, where people gathered not only to share meals but also to share ideas, resources, and support. The town itself underwent a transformation that could only be described as extraordinary. Businesses that had once operated solely for profit began adopting more community-focused practices. Pay-it-forward programs became commonplace, and the local economy thrived as residents supported businesses that aligned with their values. The cafe that had once been the site of Gerald's humiliation was now a thriving community eatery under its new ownership, with a wall dedicated to stories of kindness and resilience. Gerald's story was among them, his photograph and a brief description serving as a reminder of how far the town had come. Despite all the progress, Gerald never forgot the struggle that had brought him to this point. He often spoke at community events, sharing his journey with a mix of humility and wisdom. "I'm not here because of my own strength," he would say. "I'm here because someone saw me when I felt invisible, because someone chose to stand up when it would have been easier to stay silent, and because a community decided that kindness was worth fighting for." One particularly memorable moment came when Gerald was invited to speak at a statewide conference on community development. Standing in front of hundreds of attendees, he recounted the pivotal moment at the cafe and the ripple effect it had created. "It's not about the big gestures," he said, his voice steady and clear. "It's about the small moments of humanity that remind us we're all in this together. If each of us can find the courage to be kind, the world will change in ways we can't even imagine."